The wind, a malevolent preacher, howls its sermon across the skeletal timbers of the half-repaired church roof. Rain, sharp as shattered glass, stings Alara's face, plastering her thin calico dress to the swell of her belly. Each gust threatens to peel her from the treacherous shingles like an unwanted scab. Below, the town of Redemption huddles, a scatter of mud-chinked cabins and false-fronted stores, oblivious or indifferent. It's her church, her burden, the leaking roof a mirror to the slow seep of her hope. Her hammer, slick with rain, slips. For a heart-stopping moment, she dangles, one hand scrabbling for purchase, the other instinctively clutching her womb. A lightning flash illuminates a figure below, a man on horseback, materializing from the gray chaos of the storm as if sculpted from the tempest itself. He's looking up, a silhouette against the bruised sky, and even from this distance, she feels the weight of his gaze. Danger's close and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. The man's voice, when it comes, is impossibly calm against the wind's fury, a low rumble that cuts through the roar. Hold on, ma'am. I'm coming. He's off his horse in an instant, moving with a fluid grace that belies the treacherous mud. Alara clings, breath sawing in her lungs, the fate of her unborn child a leaden weight within her. The world is a maelstrom of wind, rain, and the terrifyingly fragile grip of her fingers. And with those words, "I'm coming," a stranger's promise in the heart of the storm, her desperate solitude was, for a moment, breached. The wind had been a restless whisper all morning, a nervous sigh through the sparse pines that clung to the hills overlooking Redemption. Alara had watched it from the small, dusty window of the parsonage, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest with each rising moan. The church roof, a patchwork of her late husband Michael's hopeful repairs and her own increasingly desperate efforts, was a constant worry. Michael, bless his gentle soul, had been a man of God, not a carpenter. The leaks, once mere annoyances, had become insidious streams, threatening the pulpit Bible, the few precious hymnals, and the rough-hewn pews that represented the entirety of their shared dream. She was Michael's widow, 6 months gone with his child, a fact that seemed to make her both an object of pity and a quiet inconvenience to the small, struggling congregation. They offered condolences, a few meager provisions, but the heavy work, the securing of her small world against the encroaching wilderness and weather that fell to her. Pride, or perhaps a stubborn refusal to be seen as helpless, had driven her out with the hammer and nails whenever a dry spell allowed. The town, nestled in a valley that seemed to collect hardship like a basin, had its own struggles. Another mouth to feed, another leaky roof among many, was hardly their priority. The coming storm, however, felt different. There was a viciousness to the gathering clouds, a darkness that promised more than just rain, promised destruction. And so, with a grim set to her jaw, Alara had gathered her tools, her swollen belly a cumbersome but unyielding presence. The ladder was rickety, each rung a protest under her weight, but she had ascended, rung by painful rung, to the exposed rafters. She had to try. This church, this small, crumbling edifice, was all she had left of Michael, the only home her child might know. The stranger, Silas, as she would later learn his name, moved with an unnerving competence. He hadn't wasted words after that initial, life-affirming call. He'd assessed the situation with a glance, the precarious ladder, the storm's escalating fury, her own teetering exhaustion. He'd found a length of rope in his saddlebag, thick and reassuringly strong, and with a few deft movements, had fashioned a crude harness around a sturdy chimney stack that Michael had, thankfully, built with uncharacteristic solidity. He hadn't climbed the ladder. Instead, with a strength that seemed almost inhuman, he'd scaled the rain-slicked wall of the church itself, finding purchase in the gaps between the logs, moving like a shadow against the dark wood. He reached her just as another violent gust tore at the roof, ripping away a fresh swathe of shingles she'd painstakingly laid only days before. His hand, calloused and strong, closed around her arm, steadying her. "Easy now," he'd murmured, his voice close to her ear, surprisingly gentle despite the harshness of the elements. There was no judgment in his eyes, only a focused intensity. He worked quickly, securing the rope, his movements economical and precise. He smelled of rain, leather, and something else, something wild and untamed, like the storm itself. The descent was a blur of terror and relief. She felt herself lifted, guided, her weight almost insignificant in his powerful grasp. He shielded her body with his own against the driving rain, taking the brunt of the wind. When her feet finally touched the muddy ground, her legs buckled, and he caught her, holding her upright until the world stopped spinning. He led her, stumbling, towards the relative shelter of the parsonage door, his horse standing patiently nearby, raindrops glistening on its dark coat. Inside, the small cabin felt like a haven, though the wind still rattled the ill-fitting window panes and the drumming of rain on the roof was a constant, deafening roar. Silas didn't speak, merely propped her gently onto the single worn armchair near the cold hearth. He moved about the small room, his presence filling it, yet he was unobtrusive. He found a tinderbox and, after a few attempts with flint and steel, coaxed a small flame to life in the fireplace, adding kindling with a practiced hand. The nascent warmth was a balm to her chilled bones. Alara watched him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. He was a tall man, lean but powerfully built, his face weathered and etched by sun and wind. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky themselves, were observant, missing nothing. He wore trail-worn clothes, a gun belt low on his hips, the holster tied down, the mark of a man familiar with trouble. He was a stranger, a drifter by all appearances, yet he had appeared when she needed him most, a silent guardian emerging from the tempest. The townsfolk of Redemption were a cautious lot, wary of outsiders, their lives etched with the harsh realities of frontier existence. News, especially of the dramatic variety, traveled fast, even in a storm. It wasn't long before Mrs. Henderson, the town's self-appointed moral compass and purveyor of gossip, her bonnet askew and her shawl clutched tightly, braved the downpour to peer through Alara's window. Alara saw her pale, inquisitive face for a fleeting moment before Silas, seeming to sense the intrusion, moved to stand partially in front of the window, his broad back an effective shield. Mrs. Henderson's face vanished. That, Alara knew, was the first antagonist micro-cameo, the subtle disapproval, the wagging tongues that would surely follow. The presence of an unknown man in the widow's cabin, storm or no storm, would be grist for their mill. Silas seemed unconcerned. He found a battered kettle, filled it from her water bucket, and set it on the hook over the growing fire. The silence between them was thick, punctuated only by the storm's rage and the crackle of the flames. Alara felt a tremor of fear, not of the man himself, but of the unknown, of the debt she now owed him, of the questions his presence would raise. He had saved her, undoubtedly. But what did a man like that want in a place like Redemption, and why had he risked his own safety for a stranger on a church roof? The initial awkwardness of their situation was palpable. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his large frame surprisingly graceful in the confines of her small home. He didn't pry, didn't ask questions, just tended to the immediate needs: warmth, the promise of hot water. He'd retrieved her discarded hammer from where it had fallen near the church wall, placing it quietly by the door. A small act, but it spoke volumes. He understood, perhaps, the importance of that tool of her struggle. She finally found her voice, raspy and weak. "Thank you," she managed, the words feeling inadequate. You saved my life." My baby's life. He turned from the fire, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Anyone would have done the same, ma'am. His voice was low, a gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in the small space. But Alara knew that wasn't true. She'd seen the averted gazes in town, felt the subtle pulling away. Most would have clucked their tongues and said a prayer from the safety of their own homes. Few would have scaled a collapsing church wall in a full-blown gale. "There's tea," she said, gesturing vaguely towards a tin on the shelf. "If you'd like some, an offering, a small token of gratitude, a way to bridge the chasm of their unfamiliarity." He nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible movement. "Obliged." The rescue itself was the catalyst, the violent, rain-lashed crucible in which their paths had irrevocably merged. He had lifted her physically, but in doing so, he had also lifted a fraction of the crushing weight of her solitude. Now, in the aftermath, a new kind of tension settled in, the tension of the unknown, of unspoken expectations. He was a mystery, this quiet cowboy. His intervention had been decisive, almost primal, a direct response to her peril. There was no hint of pity in his actions, only a profound, almost instinctual protectiveness. She watched him as he found the tea tin and 2 chipped mugs. His hands, though calloused and scarred, moved with a surprising gentleness. He measured the tea carefully, his focus absolute. It was the same focus he'd displayed on the roof, a stillness at the center of chaos. This man, she sensed, was accustomed to harsh realities, to making life-or-death decisions with little fanfare. When the tea was brewed, strong and dark, he handed her a mug, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second. A jolt, unexpected and unsettling, shot up her arm. She pulled her hand back quickly, her cheeks flushing. He seemed not to notice, or if he did, he gave no sign, turning back to stare into the fire, his own mug cradled in his hands. The first minor conflict, if it could be called that, was internal. Her gratitude warred with a lifetime of ingrained caution. Men who appeared out of nowhere, offering aid without asking for anything in return, were rare, and often, their motives were not as pure as their actions might suggest. Redemption was a hard town, but it had taught her to be wary. Yet, looking at his stoic profile, the lines of weariness etched around his eyes, she found it hard to sustain her suspicion. There was a profound sadness about him, a loneliness that resonated with her own. "You're not from Redemption," she stated, more than asked. It was obvious. No one in Redemption possessed his quiet competence, his air of having seen too much of the world beyond their small valley. He took a slow sip of tea before answering. "No, ma'am. Just passing through." The standard answer of a drifter. But his eyes, when they briefly met hers, held something more, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher. Was he running from something? Or toward something? "The storm caught you out?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "It did," he confirmed, offering no further details. His reticence was a wall, smooth and unyielding. The wind howled, pressing against the little cabin as if trying to reclaim him, to pull him back out into its wild embrace. Alara shivered, despite the growing warmth from the fire. The thought of him leaving, of facing the aftermath of the storm and the town's scrutiny alone, was suddenly unbearable. He had been a shield against the tempest, and now, in his quiet presence, he was a shield against her fear. "The roof," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's in a bad way." He nodded. "I saw. Michael, my husband, he tried his best." She hadn't meant to say it, to offer personal details to the stranger. But the words tumbled out, driven by a need to explain, to justify her own reckless actions. "He was the preacher here. This church, this house. It's all I have." Silas looked at her then, a long, searching look. The firelight cast shadows on his face, making him seem older, starker. "A man does what he can, ma'am," he said, his voice softer now. And a woman too, it seems. There was no judgment, no condemnation of her being on that roof. Just a quiet acknowledgement of her struggle. It was more understanding than she'd received from anyone in redemption since Michael's passing. That small sentence, that simple acceptance, began to chip away at her reserve. Perhaps, just perhaps, this mysterious cowboy was not a threat, but an unlikely temporary ally. The storm raged on outside, but within the small cabin, a fragile peace, as tentative as the new flames in the hearth, began to take hold. He had made his choice on that rooftop, a choice to intervene. Now, in the quiet aftermath, she found herself making a choice too. To trust, just a little, this stranger the storm had brought. The storm abated as dawn approached, its fury spent, leaving behind a world washed clean and utterly devastated. The wind died to a mournful sigh, and the rain softened to a gentle patter, then ceased altogether. A pale, watery light began to seep through the window, illuminating the small cabin and the man who still sat by the dying embers of the fire. Silas hadn't slept, or if he had, he'd done so sitting upright, a silent sentinel. Alara, exhausted, had drifted into a fitful, dream-haunted sleep in the armchair, waking intermittently to the comforting solidity of his presence. As the light grew, she could see the full extent of the weariness in his face. He looked like a man who had ridden hard and long, not just through the night storm, but through a lifetime of them. He rose stiffly, stretching, the movement surprisingly fluid for a man his size. He went to the window, peering out at the sodden landscape. "Sun's trying to break through," he observed, his voice still low and gravelly. Alara pushed herself up, her body aching, the baby shifting within her as if in protest. I should see about the church." The thought filled her with a fresh wave of despair. The damage would be extensive. Silas turned from the window. "I'll take a look, ma'am. You rest." It wasn't a request, but a quiet statement of intent. Before she could protest, he had picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and was out the door. She watched him from the window as he walked towards the church, his stride purposeful, his shoulders squared against the morning chill. He moved with the land, a part of it yet separate. The town of Redemption stirred slowly, emerging cautiously into the storm's aftermath. Smoke curled from chimneys, thin and hesitant. Alara saw Mr. Grumbles, the storekeeper, step out onto his porch, surveying the muddy track that served as Main Street. His gaze flickered towards the church, then to Silas, who was already assessing the damage to the roof, his dark form stark against the bruised sky. Mr. Grumbles pursed his lips, a look of disapproval settling on his face before he retreated back inside. The judgment had begun. Silas returned an hour later, his expression grim. "It's bad," he said, his brevity more telling than a lengthy explanation. "Whole sections gone, rafters exposed. Some water damage inside, near the north wall." Alara's heart sank. "I knew it." She felt the sting of tears, hot and unwelcome, and blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of this man. He seemed to sense her distress, though his face remained impassive. "It's fixable," he stated. "Not it can be fixed, but it's fixable, a subtle difference, but one that offered a sliver of hope." "I don't have the money for lumber," she confessed, the admission costing her. "Or for help." Silas looked around the small parsonage, his gaze taking in the threadbare rug, the meager furnishings, the carefully mended curtains. He saw the poverty, but he didn't comment on it. Instead, he said, "There's timber up on the ridge, good pine, fallen in the storm most likely. We could salvage some." The word hung in the air. It was an offer casually made, yet immense in its implications. He was offering his labor, his skill. He was offering to stay, at least for a while. "Why would you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know me. You don't owe this town, or this church, anything. He met her gaze then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond the stoic reserve, a weariness, a hint of old pain. Maybe, he said softly, I'm just tired of riding. He looked away, towards the distant, cloud-wreathed mountains. And a place of worship shouldn't be left to ruin. It wasn't a full explanation, far from it. But it was enough. Alara found herself nodding, a slow, hesitant agreement. To refuse his help would be foolish, suicidal even. And a part of her, a part she hadn't realized was so starved for companionship, didn't want him to go. Thus began their strange partnership. Silas was a man of few words but relentless action. He possessed an innate knowledge of woodcraft, of tools, of how to make something from almost nothing. He had an axe in his saddle pack, and with Alara's permission, he took Michael's rusty saw and set about sharpening it with a stone he found by the creek. They worked side by side, a silent, efficient team. Alara, despite her pregnancy, refused to be idle. She cleared debris, sorted usable shingles, and fetched water, her movements slow but determined. Silas did the heavy lifting, felling damaged trees with powerful, rhythmic swings of his axe, hauling logs, and beginning the arduous task of shaping them into usable planks and supports. He taught her, with quiet patience, how to properly nail shingles, how to measure cuts, how to see the grain of the wood. He never condescended, never treated her as a hindrance, despite her physical limitations. Their days fell into a rhythm. Dawn brought work, the sharp tang of freshly cut pine filling the air, the rhythmic thud of the hammer a counterpoint to the chirping of birds. Evenings brought a shared, usually silent, meal by the fire. Alara would cook what little she had: beans, cornbread, occasionally a piece of salted pork. Silas ate without complaint, his appetite hearty. He never asked for more than she offered. The town watched them. Mrs. Henderson made regular, unsubtle patrols past the church, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. Other townsfolk would pause in their errands, their curiosity poorly veiled. There were whispers, Alara knew. The widow and the stranger. What was he to her? Why was he staying? Was it proper? One afternoon, as Silas was high on the newly erected scaffolding, wrestling a heavy beam into place, Pastor Davies from the neighboring settlement of Harmony Creek rode into Redemption. He was a portly man with a booming voice and an air of self-importance. He'd heard, apparently, of Redemption's preacherless state and the damaged church, and had come to offer his guidance. He found Alara sorting nails. "Mrs. Foster," he began, his tone unctuous, "I came as soon as I heard. Terrible tragedy, this storm, and your efforts are commendable for a woman in your condition." His gaze flickered dismissively towards the church, then up at Silas. "But perhaps this task is beyond you. And this gentleman," he gestured vaguely upwards, "is he a member of your congregation?" Before Alara could formulate a polite, yet firm, response, Silas spoke from above. His voice, though not loud, carried clearly. "Just a man lending a hand, preacher. Seems God's house needed it." Pastor Davies puffed up. "While your intentions may be good, my son, repairs of this magnitude require expertise, and propriety must be observed." He looked pointedly at Alara's belly, then back at Silas. Anger, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's weariness. "Mr. Silas has more expertise in his little finger than many I know," she said, her voice tight. "And he has shown more Christian charity than I've seen in this valley for many months. The roof will be repaired, Pastor, with or without your guidance." Pastor Davies's face mottled. He clearly wasn't used to being rebuffed, especially by a woman. He sputtered for a moment, then said, "Well, I can see my concerns are not appreciated. I shall leave you to your arrangements." He turned on his heel and stalked back to his horse, muttering about impropriety and the lamentable state of redemption's spiritual well-being. From the scaffolding, Silas gave a low chuckle. When Alara looked up, he winked, a brief, surprising flash of humor in his serious eyes. It was a small moment, but it solidified their alliance. They were in this together, facing not just the elements, but the judgment of the world outside their small circle of labor. As the days turned into weeks, the church began to transform. The gaping holes in the roof were slowly covered. New rafters, hewn by Silas's skilled hands, replaced the rotten ones. The structure, once fragile and vulnerable, began to look solid, secure. And as the church was rebuilt, something else was being built too. A quiet understanding. A fragile trust between the pregnant widow and the mysterious cowboy. Alara learned to read Silas's moods by the set of his jaw, the way he handled his tools, the subtle shifts in his silence. She learned that he preferred his coffee black, that he had a soft spot for the stray dog that sometimes hung around the parsonage, sharing his scraps when he thought she wasn't looking. She noticed the way his eyes would sometimes drift to the western horizon, a longing, almost haunted look in their depths. He was a man with a past, she was certain of it, a past that rode him as surely as he rode his dark horse. He, in turn, learned her rhythms. He knew when she was tiring, though she rarely admitted it, and would find a less strenuous task for her, or simply declare it was time for a break. He saw her quiet determination, her fierce love for the memory of her husband and the child she carried. He began to talk a little more, not about himself, but about the work, about the way the trees grew, the signs of changing weather. Small things, but they were bridges across the silence. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the scent of pine and wood smoke filling the cabin, Alara found the courage to ask, "Where will you go, Silas? When the church is finished?" He stared into the flames for a long time before answering. "Don't rightly know, ma'am," he said, his voice unusually rough. "Haven't thought that far ahead." "You could stay," she said, the words surprising her as much as they probably surprised him. "Redemption, it's not much, but there's work to be found. A good man, a skilled man like you." She trailed off, embarrassed by her boldness. He looked at her then, his gaze intense, searching. "There are reasons a man keeps moving, Alara." He used her first name for the first time, and it sounded strange, yet strangely right on his lips. "Sometimes, staying in one place is more dangerous than the road." The implication hung heavy in the air. He was a man with shadows, shadows that could endanger anyone who got too close. The progress on the church was a visible testament to their shared efforts, a beacon of emerging hope. But Silas's words were a stark reminder of the precariousness of their situation, of the secrets he carried. The antagonist was not just the judgmental townsfolk or the harsh elements. It was also the unnamed threat in Silas's past, a threat that could, at any moment, arrive in redemption. The fear that his words ignited was a cold counterpoint to the growing warmth she felt in his presence. She was beginning to rely on him, not just for the physical labor, but for the quiet companionship, the unspoken support. The thought of him leaving, of being alone again with the full weight of her responsibilities and the town's scrutiny, was a bleak prospect. The deepening personal stakes were no longer just about the church or her survival. They were about him. She found herself watching him, noticing the way the sun caught the silver in his dark hair at the temples, the rare moments when his stern face softened into something akin to a smile. She saw the fundamental decency in him, the quiet honor that guided his actions, regardless of whatever darkness he hinted at in his past. He was becoming more than just a rescuer, more than a helper. He was becoming important. One Sunday, with the roof nearly complete, a few of the more curious or perhaps contrite townsfolk drifted towards the church. They hadn't held a proper service since Michael's passing. Old Man Hemlock, who had been Michael's staunchest supporter, peered inside, his watery eyes widening at the transformation. The leaks were gone. The north wall, once stained and damp, was now clean and dry, the wood smelling faintly of pine. It's a marvel, Widow Foster," he stammered, his gaze shifting to Silas, who stood quietly by the door, his hat in his hands. "A true marvel. And you, sir," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect, "you have wrought a miracle here." Silas merely inclined his head. "The widow did her share, Mr. Hemlock. More than her share." A small flush of pleasure warmed Ilara's cheeks. It was the first public acknowledgement of her efforts from anyone other than Silas. Perhaps, she thought, things were beginning to change. Perhaps the town was starting to see past their prejudices. But the fragile peace was shattered a few days later. A rider came into town, not a drifter, but a man with a badge, a U.S. Marshal, his face hard, his eyes cold and assessing. He reined in his horse in front of Grumble's store, his gaze sweeping the small street. Ilara, who was on her way to the creek for water, felt a prickle of unease. Marshals didn't come to a place like Redemption without a reason, and that reason was usually trouble. The marshal, a man named Cutler, dismounted and began asking questions. Ilara couldn't hear the words, but she saw Mr. Grumbles pointing towards the church. Her heart began to pound. She hurried back to the parsonage, her mind racing. Silas was inside, mending a piece of harness. "Silas," she said, her voice breathless, "there's a marshal in town. He's asking questions. I think he's looking for someone." Silas went very still. The piece of leather slipped from his fingers. He rose slowly, his face becoming a mask, the warmth and quiet humor she had begun to see in him vanishing as if it had never been. The air in the cabin grew cold. "Describe him," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. She did, her words tumbling over each other. Tall, lean, with cold eyes and a silver star. Silas nodded, a single, grim movement. "Cutler," he said, the name a curse on his lips. He walked to the window, peering out cautiously. "He found me." The unspoken threat had arrived. The antagonist micro-cameo wasn't just a disapproving townsfolk anymore. It was the full force of the law, personified by a relentless hunter. The quiet sanctuary they had built, the fragile hope that had begun to bloom, was now directly in jeopardy. Silas's past, the one he'd alluded to with such weariness, had caught up with him, and with Ilara. The choice he had spoken of, the danger of staying in one place, was now starkly, terrifyingly real. Their shared work on the church, their growing understanding, all of it felt like it was about to be torn apart. The moments after Silas's quiet pronouncement, "He found me," stretched into an eternity of suffocating silence, broken only by the distant, indistinct murmur of voices from the direction of the town proper. Ilara's mind reeled. Cutler. The name meant nothing to her, but the grim finality in Silas's tone, the sudden shuddering of his expression, told her everything she needed to know. This was the shadow he carried, the reason for his wandering, the unnamed danger that had always lurked just beyond the horizon of their shared days. "What will you do?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to her belly, a protective gesture that had become second nature. The safety of her child, her own precarious future, was inextricably linked to this man, this enigmatic stranger who had become so much more. Silas turned from the window, his face etched with a harsh resignation. "He won't leave without me. Cutler's like a bloodhound. Once he has the scent, he doesn't give up." "But why?" Ilara pressed, needing to understand, to grasp the nature of the threat that had descended upon them. "What does he want you for?" Silas hesitated, his gaze dropping to the worn floorboards. The internal struggle was visible in the tightening of his jaw, the clenching of his fists. He had guarded his past so carefully, parceling out only the smallest, most innocuous fragments of himself. To reveal more now, in the face of imminent capture, was a profound act of trust, or perhaps of desperation. "It was a long time ago," he began, his voice low and strained. "Another life, almost. I was younger, angrier." He paused, searching for the right words, or perhaps the least damning ones. "There was a fight. A man died. It wasn't murder, Elara. Not like he'll say it was. It was self-defense. But the man had powerful friends. They twisted it, made me out to be something I wasn't." He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a raw pain that made her ache in sympathy. "I ran. Been running ever since. Cutler, he was the one assigned to bring me in. He made it his personal crusade." Elara absorbed his words, her initial fear giving way to a fierce, protective anger. She had seen the goodness in Silas, the quiet integrity, the gentle strength. The man he described, the killer Cutler was hunting, didn't reconcile with the man who had risked his life for her on a stormy roof, who had patiently taught her to mend shingles, who shared his meager rations with a stray dog. "They won't listen?" she asked. "To your side of it?" A bitter smile touched Silas's lips. "Justice is a rich man's luxury, Elara. Poor drifters don't get much of it. Cutler will see me hang, if he can." The stark reality of his words chilled her to the bone. The church, so close to completion, their shared labor a testament to resilience and new beginnings, suddenly seemed like a fragile monument to a dream about to be shattered. "You have to go," she said, the words tearing at her, even as she knew they were necessary. "Now, before he comes here." Silas looked at her, a strange expression in his eyes, gratitude, regret, and something else, something deeper, more profound. "And leave you to face the questions? To explain why you harbored a wanted man?" "I'll tell them the truth," she said, lifting her chin. "You saved my life. You helped rebuild this church when no one else would. That's the only truth that matters to me." But even as she spoke, she knew it wouldn't be enough for a man like Cutler, or for the wagging tongues of redemption. Before Silas could respond, the sound of heavy footsteps approached the parsonage door. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the small cabin. Cutler. He hadn't wasted any time. Silas's hand instinctively went to the gun on his hip, his body tensing, coiling like a spring. Elara saw the flicker of the hunted animal in his eyes, the instinct to fight or flee. "No, Silas," she pleaded, laying a hand on his arm. "Don't. Not like this. Violence would only confirm Cutler's version of the story. It would seal his fate." The knock came again, louder this time, more impatient. "Silas Kane. I know you're in there. This is U.S. Marshal Cutler. Open up." Silas looked at Elara, his eyes filled with a bleak despair. For a moment, she thought he would ignore her plea, that he would choose to fight. Then, slowly, agonizingly, his hand dropped from his gun. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He would not run, not this time. But neither, it seemed, would he simply surrender to Cutler's narrative. He took a deep breath, his shoulders straightening. He was no longer just the quiet drifter. He was a man facing his accuser, his past rearing up to claim him. "Stay behind me, Elara," he said softly, his voice imbued with a protective authority. He walked to the door and pulled it open. Marshal Cutler stood on the threshold, a tall, imposing figure, his hand resting near the butt of his own holstered pistol. His eyes, cold and gray as river stones, flickered past Silas to Elara, lingering for a moment on her swollen belly before returning to fix on Silas with an unnerving intensity. "Kane," Cutler said, his voice flat, devoid of surprise. "Been a long time." "Cutler," Silas acknowledged, his tone equally devoid of emotion. "Figured I'd find you holed up somewhere eventually," Cutler continued, his gaze sweeping the interior of the cabin, taking in the signs of Silas's presence, his bedroll in the corner, his hat on the peg. Though a church parsonage with a pregnant widow wasn't high on my list of likely hideouts. You always were full of surprises. There was a sneer in his voice, a contempt that made Alara bristle. I wasn't hiding, Cutler, Silas said, his voice calm, steady. I was working, helping Mrs. Foster rebuild her church. Cutler snorted. Charitable work? From you, Kane? That's a new one. Last I recall, your work tended more towards brawling and other things. The implication was clear, heavy with accusation. What happened back then wasn't what you think, Silas stated, his voice firm. It was self-defense. That's what they all say, Cutler retorted, unmoved. You'll have plenty of time to tell your story to a judge. Assuming you make it to 1 inch, he took a step forward, into the cabin. His presence filling the small space, exuding an aura of menace. You're coming with me, Kane. Quietly, if you've got any sense left. This was the turning point, the game changer. Silas's past was no longer a shadowy secret. It was here, embodied in the relentless Marshall Cutler. The choice was no longer just about whether Silas would stay or go. It was about whether his story would be heard, whether he would be dragged away to a grim, predetermined fate, or whether there was any chance for truth, for justice. Alara stepped forward, moving to stand slightly beside Silas, not behind him as he'd instructed. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a stronger emotion was surging through her, a fierce, unwavering loyalty to the man who had shown her nothing but kindness and quiet strength. Marshall, she said, her voice clear and surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. Mr. Kane speaks the truth. He has been a godsend to me and to this town. He saved my life in the storm. He has worked tirelessly without thought of payment to repair our church. That is the man I know. Cutler's gaze shifted to her, his eyes narrowing. Ma'am, with all due respect, you don't know this man. He's a fugitive, wanted for murder. I know what I see, Alara insisted, her chin held high. I see a good man, a decent man. Whatever happened in his past, he deserves a chance to tell his side of it, fairly. Cutler's lips thinned. The law doesn't care much for a woman's sentimentality, Mrs. Foster. Cares about facts. And the fact is, Silas Kane is my prisoner. He reached inside his coat, presumably for handcuffs. The ramp-up to a showdown was clear. It wouldn't be a gunfight, not if Alara could help it. But it would be a confrontation nonetheless, a confrontation of wills, of narratives, of character. Silas had made his decision not to run, not to fight with weapons. Now Alara made hers. To stand with him, to lend her voice, her credibility, however small it might be in the eyes of the law, to his defense. There must be a way, Alara said, her mind racing, searching for a solution. Any solution that didn't involve Silas being dragged away in chains. A hearing here in redemption, before he's taken miles away, where no one knows him, where his word means nothing. Cutler actually laughed, a short, harsh sound. A hearing? In this backwater? Conducted by whom, ma'am? The town drunk? The gossiping biddies? He gestured dismissively. The circuit judge won't be through here for another 6 months, if he comes at all. Kane will be tried in Prescott, where the crime was committed. The mention of Prescott seemed to make Silas flinch, almost imperceptibly. That was where his powerful enemies resided, where his chances of a fair trial were likely non-existent. The high-pressure countdown was on. Cutler was impatient, his authority absolute, or so it seemed. The tactical planning, if it could be called that, was happening in real time, born of desperation and a dawning, defiant courage on Alara's part. She knew redemption. She knew its people, their flaws, but also their underlying, if often hidden, sense of fairness. If they could hear Silas, if they could see him as she did, then let the people of redemption hear him, Alara declared, a sudden, bold idea taking root. Let them hear what he has to say. Let them see the work he has done. They may not be judges, Marshal, but they are decent folk. Their opinion should matter. Cutler stared at her, momentarily nonplussed by her audacity. He clearly hadn't expected such resistance, such a passionate defense from the quiet widow. Silas looked at Alara, a flicker of surprise, then a deep, unreadable emotion in his eyes. He had been prepared to face his fate alone, to be judged by his past. He hadn't anticipated an advocate, a champion, in this small, determined woman. "It's irregular, ma'am," Cutler said, his tone hardening. "Highly irregular. I have my orders. And I have my church," Alara countered, her voice ringing with conviction. A church this man helped save. A church that stands for truth and sanctuary. If the law won't offer him a chance to speak his truth here, then perhaps the community he served will. She was making a stand not just for Silas but for a principle. It was a gamble, a desperate, improbable plea, but it was all she had. The alternative, to watch Silas be led away, his story unheard, his fate sealed, was unthinkable. The repaired roof of the church, visible through the open doorway, seemed to stand as a silent testament to his character, a solid, tangible piece of evidence against the Marshal's stark accusations. The confrontation had moved from the confines of the small cabin to a larger stage, with the conscience of a small frontier town as its potential audience. Marshal Cutler was a man accustomed to obedience, to the immediate capitulation that his badge and his reputation usually inspired. Alara's unwavering defense of Silas, her audacious proposal for an informal hearing, clearly irked him. He paced the small confines of the parsonage, his spurs jingling with each agitated step, his gaze flickering between Silas's stoic face and Alara's resolute one. "This is highly unorthodox, Mrs. Foster," he repeated, his voice tight with controlled anger. "I have a warrant for Silas Kane. My duty is to execute that warrant and transport him for trial, not to engage in town hall debates about his character. And what if his character is the very evidence that has been ignored?" Alara pressed, her voice gaining strength. "You say he's a murderer. I say he's a man who risked his life for a stranger, who worked for weeks without pay to shelter a congregation he doesn't even belong to. Which Silas Kane is the town of redemption supposed to believe in, Marshal? The one described on your piece of paper? Or the one they've seen with their own eyes?" Her words, impassioned and direct, seemed to strike a chord, not with Cutler, but with a presence that had been gathering outside. Peeking through the window, Alara saw that a small crowd had assembled Mr. Grumbles, Mrs. Henderson, her face a mixture of shock and avid curiosity, Old Man Hemlock, and a few other familiar faces from Redemption. They had heard the raised voices, sensed the unfolding drama. Silas, who had remained silent during this exchange, finally spoke, his voice low and weary, but firm. "Alara, don't. This is my burden to bear," he looked at Cutler. "I'll go with you, Marshal. No trouble." But Alara shook her head fiercely.
"No, Silas.
It's not just your burden anymore. You didn't ask for my help on that roof, but you gave yours freely. Now it's my turn." She turned back to Cutler, her eyes blazing. "Let him speak, Marshal. Right here, right now, in front of the church he helped rebuild. Let the people hear him. If you're so sure of his guilt, what do you have to fear from a few honest words?" Cutler looked from Alara to the faces peering through the window, then back to Silas. He was a lawman, but he was also politically astute enough to understand optics. Dragging a man away against the vocal protests of the town, especially when that man was being defended by a pregnant widow, wouldn't look good. It might even lead to questions from his superiors, especially if Redemption was as tight-knit, or as easily swayed, as Alara seemed to believe. He let out a sigh, a gust of frustrated air. "All right, Mrs. Foster. All right." He held up a hand, as if to stem her flow of words. "Not a trial, not a hearing, but I'll allow him to say his piece. 5 minutes. Then he's mine, He clearly thought it was a pointless exercise, a way to humor the overwrought woman and the curious townsfolk before getting on with his duty. A wave of relief, so profound it almost buckled her knees, washed over Alara. It was a small concession, a tiny window of opportunity, but it was more than she had dared hope for. The courtroom was the muddy patch of ground in front of the newly repaired church. The sky had cleared, the sun casting long afternoon shadows. The townsfolk of Redemption gathered, a hesitant, curious semicircle. Mrs. Henderson stood at the forefront, her arms crossed, her expression one of severe judgment, yet her eyes were alight with an almost feverish interest. Old Man Hemlock, however, looked at Silas with a dawning sympathy. Mr. Grumbles remained inscrutable. Marshal Cutler positioned himself to one side, his hand never far from his gun, his skepticism palpable. Alara stood beside Silas, her presence a silent testament to her belief in him. Silas looked out at the small crowd, his face unreadable. He wasn't a man of many words, and public speaking was clearly not his forte. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze sweeping over their faces, lingering for a moment on the solid, newly shingled roof of the church. He began, his voice hesitant at first, then gaining a quiet strength. "Folks," he said, his voice carrying in the still afternoon air. I ain't much for speeches. Marshal Cutler here says I'm wanted for murder. Says I killed a man back in the Arizona Territory, near Prescott." A murmur went through the crowd. Murder was a heavy word. "It's true a man died," Silas continued, his voice steady, his gaze direct. "His name was Ben Hatcher. He was a bully, a man who liked to use his fists and his father's money to get his way. He took something from me, something that mattered. I confronted him. He came at me with a knife." Silas unconsciously touched his side, where Alara had once seen a long, faded scar when he'd been washing up at the creek. "I defended myself. It was him or me. His knife, it went into him during the struggle." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Hatcher's father is a powerful man. He owns half the county. He made sure the story that got told was the one he wanted. That I was a common drifter, a troublemaker, who murdered his son in cold blood. There were no witnesses who'd speak against him. So I ran." He looked directly at Cutler. "I've been running for 5 years, Marshal. Not because I'm a killer, but because I knew I wouldn't get a fair trial in Prescott. Not then, not now." His gaze softened as he turned to Alara. "I came to Redemption by chance, caught in the storm. I saw Mrs. Foster on that roof in danger. I did what any man with a shred of decency would do. I helped her. And then," he gestured towards the church. "This place needed mending. Felt right to help. To build something, instead of always running from something." He looked back at the townsfolk. "I ain't asking for your pity, just asking you to consider that there might be more to a man than what's written on a warrant. You've seen me work. You've seen what Mrs. Foster and I have done here." His voice was raw with an emotion he rarely showed. "That's all I have to say." Silence descended, thick and heavy. The townsfolk looked at each other, then at Silas, then at the repaired church. They had heard his words, simple, direct, without embellishment. They had seen his labor, the tangible proof of his character in the strong timbers and neat shingles of their church. Marshal Cutler shifted impatiently. "Touching story, Kane, but it changes nothing. The law is the law." He stepped forward, ready to take Silas into custody. But then Old Man Hemlock stepped forward from the crowd. He was frail, his back bent with age, but his voice was surprisingly firm. "Marshal," he said, his gaze unwavering, "I knew Michael Foster. He was a good man, a man of God. He believed in redemption, in second chances. This church, it was his dream." He looked at Silas. "I've seen this man, Kane, work harder than any 2 men in this town. I've seen him treat Mrs. Foster with respect. I've seen him turn this wreck of a building back into a house of worship." He paused, then added, his voice ringing with conviction, "The man who did that, he ain't no cold-blooded killer. I don't care what some piece of paper from Prescott says. I believe him." A murmur of assent rippled through the small crowd. Mrs. Henderson, surprisingly, nodded slowly, her stern face softening just a fraction. Even Mr. Grumbles looked thoughtful. Cutler was taken aback. He had expected silent acquiescence, not this open defiance, this championing of a wanted man by the very people he'd likely dismissed as ignorant backwoods folk. Alara felt a surge of hope, fierce and bright. The emotional vulnerability Silas had shown, his quiet dignity, had resonated with them. His struggle, his plea for understanding, had touched something in their hearts. The church itself, standing proud and renewed, was his most eloquent defender. "This is irregular," Cutler protested again, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. He was outnumbered, not by force of arms, but by the moral weight of a community's changing perception. "Perhaps, Marshal," Alara said, her voice gentle but firm, "irregular justice is better than no justice at all. Silas Kane isn't asking to be set free. He's asking for a chance to prove his innocence, a real chance. Can't that start here, with the testimony of people who've seen his true character?" The confrontation had reached its peak. The townsfolk of Redemption, initially just curious bystanders, had become active participants, their collective voice rising in defense of the stranger who had served them. The power dynamic had shifted. Cutler still had the badge, the gun, the warrant. But Silas, with Alara by his side and the grudging but growing support of Redemption, had something more powerful. The truth of his actions, witnessed and affirmed. The triumph was not in Silas being immediately exonerated, but in the fact that his voice had been heard, his story considered. The sacrifice was his carefully constructed anonymity, now shattered, but replaced by something more valuable: the potential for genuine justice. Marshal Cutler, faced with the united front of the small town and the palpable evidence of Silas's good deeds, found his authority subtly undermined. He couldn't simply ignore the collective will of Redemption, not without creating a far bigger problem for himself. He scowled, clearly displeased, but the fight seemed to drain out of him. "This changes nothing about the warrant," he grumbled, more to himself than anyone else. "But," he paused, considering, "I can't hold a trial here, but I can include a deposition. Statements from you townsfolk about his character, his actions here. I'll attach it to my report. It's all I can do." It was more than Alara had dared to hope for. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was a chance, a fighting chance. Silas looked at Alara, his eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that needed no words. Their bond, forged in a storm and tempered by shared labor and mutual respect, had been tested in the fire of public accusation and had emerged stronger, more profound. They had stood together, faced down the threat, and in doing so had solidified their connection in a way that transcended circumstance. The people of Redemption, initially a source of judgment, had become unlikely allies, their perception shifted by courage and compassion. The immediate emotional aftermath was a quiet hum of relief and disbelief. Marshal Cutler, true to his grudging word, took statements from Old Man Hemlock, a surprisingly supportive Mrs. Henderson, who admitted, "He fixed the roof proper, and he's been respectful to the widow, which is more than I can say for some," and even a taciturn Mr. Grumbles, who simply stated, "Man works hard." Don't Steal, each testimony, in its own way, painted a picture of Silas Kane that starkly contrasted with the fugitive on Cutler's warrant. Silas didn't try to influence their words. He stood quietly, listening, his face betraying little of the turmoil that must have been raging within him. Alara stayed by his side, a silent pillar of support. The act of the townsfolk speaking up for him, these people who had been strangers only weeks before, was a profound testament to the change he had wrought, not just on the church, but on the community itself. Cutler, though still unconvinced of Silas's innocence in the original crime, couldn't deny the evidence of his character here in redemption. He seemed almost subdued as he prepared to leave Silas in tow. He wouldn't shackle him in front of the town, another small concession. "I'll see these depositions reach the right hands, Kane," Cutler said, his tone marginally less harsh. "Can't promise what'll come of it. But you'll get your day in court, one way or another." Silas nodded. "That's all I ever asked for, Marshal." He turned to Alara, his eyes meeting hers. The air between them crackled with unspoken emotions, fear for his future, gratitude for her unwavering faith, and a deep, burgeoning affection that had taken root in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Thank you, Alara," he said, his voice husky, "for everything." "Come back, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Come back to redemption." A faint smile touched his lips, a promise and a prayer in one. "I'll try, ma'am. I surely will try." Then he mounted his horse, riding beside Cutler, not as a captive cowering in defeat, but as a man facing an uncertain future with a newfound dignity, his back straight, his head held high. Alara watched them go, her hand resting on her belly, until they were small figures disappearing over the rise, leaving behind a town subtly changed, and a woman whose life had been irrevocably altered. The church, its roof gleaming in the afternoon sun, stood as a symbol of their shared labor, a beacon of hope. It was no longer just Michael's legacy. It was hers and Silas's too. She, Alara, the pregnant widow once seen as a burden, had found her voice, her strength. She had faced down a U.S. Marshal, rallied a town, and defended a good man. She was no longer defined by her loss or her vulnerability, but by her courage and her capacity for compassion. In the days that followed, a quiet sense of anticipation settled over redemption. The townsfolk treated Alara with a new respect, a warmth that had been missing before. They brought her small offerings, a loaf of bread, some freshly gathered eggs, a repaired shawl. They asked after Silas, their voices tinged with a genuine concern. The shared experience had forged a new bond within the community, a subtle shift away from suspicion towards a tentative solidarity. Alara continued her preparations for the baby, her heart a mixture of hope and anxiety. She spent her evenings in the parsonage, the scent of Silas's pipe tobacco faintly lingering in the air, a comforting ghost. She would often walk to the church, running her hand over the smooth, sturdy timbers he had shaped, feeling his presence in the solidity of the structure. The building was more than just wood and nails. It was a repository of shared moments, of quiet understanding, of a love that had blossomed in the heart of a storm. Weeks later, a letter arrived, carried by a circuit rider. It was addressed to Mrs. Alara Foster. Redemption, the handwriting was rough, unfamiliar. Her heart pounded as she tore it open. It was from Silas. "Dear Alara," it began, "the depositions helped. They granted me a new hearing, away from Prescott. People listened. The truth, or something close to it, came out. They called it manslaughter, self-defense under provocation. Said I served my time running. I am a free man." Alara's breath hitched. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the words. "I owe you more than I can say," the letter continued. "You gave me back my name, Alara, my life. I am heading back. If you'll still have a worn-out drifter, I reckon redemption is where I belong. With you, if that's what you want." He signed it simply, Silas. She clutched the letter to her chest, a sob escaping her lips, a sob of joy, of profound relief. He was coming back. Her mysterious cowboy, the man who had lifted her to safety, was returning to the sanctuary they had built together. She looked out the window of the parsonage, towards the church, its steeple pointing towards the wide, hopeful sky. The storm had passed in more ways than one. The repairs were complete. And as she stood there, feeling the kick of her child within her, a child who would now know its father, she knew that their life, built on a foundation of courage, compassion, and unexpected love, was just beginning. He had saved her from the storm, and she, in turn, had helped him find his own redemption. And in the quiet peace of the valley, under the shadow of the mended church, their future awaited. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.